literature review chapter with a special emphasis on note-taking. The literature review chapter is one of the most difficult chapters to write, and students find this often very challenging, and there are good reasons why it's difficult to write. The first reason is that there are multiple purposes to the literature review. So you are trying to establish the knowledge gap that will provide the rationale for your research. You'll be unpacking concepts or discussing the debates around concepts, key concepts that you are using in your research. You might be setting up a theoretical or conceptual framework, and you'll be developing multiple arguments around all of this and around your research as well. There's also a conceptual nature to literature reviews, which I think is really important to understand and often isn't explicit. And that is that the literature review is the thinking part of the thesis. It's the scholarship hub in a way. So what you're doing here is in the literature review is setting up everything that follows in the rest of the thesis. You're setting up the kind of the intellectual part of the thesis. And we construct knowledge through reflection. So this involves reading, thinking, writing, and then a process of rereading, rethinking, and rewriting. So the literature review ends up being a recursive process. So it's not something that you can do once and then you're finished with it. It's a process of continually reading, thinking, writing, reworking. And you may begin with going down one path with a particular set of readings and find that that's actually not where you needed to go, and then have to abandon that and start a new track. So it can be quite an ambiguous process, and you have to find your way through it. And unfortunately, there's no easy trick to this. But if you take the approach that this is a way of coming to grips with the kind of intellectual thinking around your project, then you won't find all of the reading a waste of time, but it will all actually build towards your final product. So because this is such a challenging chapter, I have a number of different videos on YouTube, and each of these videos will expand on different parts of the literature review. So I'm not going to go through all of what's in there today, and you can go and have a look at those videos at your leisure. I'm going to focus on something a little bit different today. So when you do a literature review, really this is the kind of path one would hope you would take, is that you begin with a focus and a purpose. You start searching, and I would set a time limit for searching. So although you are reading continually through the process, when you begin your literature review, set a certain time period and say, over this month or 2-month period, I'm going to just search for as much literature as I can find. And then make sure that you move into some kind of writing phase, because I think it's very easy to get stuck in searching, and we enjoy that part of the process, whereas writing is much more difficult. So you'll go through a searching phase, and this will also be a selecting and deciding if you're going to keep it. And then you go through, you'll be at the same time taking notes and reading, and then analyzing and synthesizing, because I'm sure you know by now, you've heard it ad nauseum, that a literature review is not just summarizing. So you have to move into a process of analyzing and synthesizing, and then you write the draft, but I would suggest that you're writing all the way through and you're writing bit by bit. So when it comes to pulling it together, it's not such an onerous task. And then you do some revising and fixing up. What I want to go through in this presentation are my top 9 tips, and I'm going to frame them all around note-taking. So the very first tip would be to focus narrowly on the research problem, but to read broadly. And if any of you have watched my videos before, you'll know that I always come back to the problem purpose statement. This is where you need to start. And I have a number of videos on how to develop the problem purpose statement. and a particular technique that helps you to focus on the core components, but then also to align them so that you get a really strong conceptualization. So, what is the problem purpose statement? Well, it contains a summary of your research problem, where the problem is stated as a problem, something about the context, the knowledge gap, the conceptual framework, the research purpose, and the research questions, and they all align. So what I'm suggesting here is that although you focus using the problem purpose statement, you still need to read broadly. So even if your research touches on a concept, something like, let's say, identity, you are going to need to read up on identity. You can't drop in concepts without having some kind of background on where those concepts are situated in the literature. So reading broadly is really important. And if you're doing a PhD, you're developing expertise in this area, and you can't develop expertise if you're not reading broadly. So the problem purpose statement will help you to keep focused so that you're not pulled in a million different directions while you're reading broadly. I want to use this paper as an example. It's a published literature review, so it's not a literature review chapter, but just to show you some of the way how some things can be written in this chapter. But honestly, in your field, if you can find a literature review paper or two and have a look at how it's written, it will really help you with this chapter. And, you know, if you're doing a doctorate or even a master's, in the end, you might want to publish your literature review chapter. Journals really like these kinds of chapters because they pull together so much from the literature. So you can think about publishing it as well. So what I wanted to highlight in this little extract was the articulation of the problem. And I'm going to start in the middle there. Cultural assumptions of women's productivity for caring and nurturing based on women's positions in the household meant that historically social work was seen as a natural extension of women's domestic work. Such assumptions, although heavily critiqued, continue to shape social work to this day. So you can see that's a real problem, and it's articulated as a problem. And there's a little bit of background to the problem, so that you're not just coming out and stating it. But that's just an example of how you can write your problem in one sentence and state it as a problem. So using that, you would then focus your reading. So as I've said, watch the videos on the problem purpose statement, and then once you've developed your problem purpose statement in this one-page document, keep it next to you, stick it up on the wall next to your computer, put it on your writing desk. Make sure that you are referring to it all the time. Tip number 2, be systematic in your searching and document the process. So what I mean here is plan a process of searching. Set up a bunch of keywords based on your problem purpose statements. Think about different ways of saying those keywords, synonyms for those keywords, because you want to capture as much data out there as possible, as much literature out there as possible. So think about multiple ways of expressing those keywords. Plan how you will search, where you will search. Use your university's resources. Most universities have excellent resources on how to use their databases and how to search. Have several methods of searching. So keyword searching could be one, through databases, but also identifying key journals in your field and then going to those journal sites and searching through those journals. Another way would be to look at key authors and look at their works and their reference lists, and then pick up references from that reference list and go and trace that. That's the snowballing method. So essentially, this is the method of your review. And whether you write it up and include it in your thesis is up to you or your supervisor. I get my students to do that because I think it provides a credibility for them around the literature review. But that is really up to you. Here's an example of, in the Jones paper, of how they wrote it up. And they had several paragraphs, but this is just one paragraph that I'm going to just quickly read. we included peer-reviewed research from social work, sociology, and gender studies. So you can see that they didn't only search narrowly within social work. They made the decision to expand the study, as well as grey literature such as government research reports and publications of professional bodies. Now, you may not include that in your literature review. We used 3 straightforward search terms: gender, social work, and feminism, which I'm sure issued huge amounts of literature, and they had to select from there. We chose to foreground the concept of gender, so they're talking you through their thinking as they went through searching. They've documented their process. A little bit further down, further detailed searches were conducted of salient peer-reviewed journals. We also used a snowballing approach, adding relevant articles and books, and conducting specific searches for articles that became of interest. Okay, so that's how you document the method. My tip is to keep a notebook or a document open on your computer, note keywords and different searching methods. So because you might be going down multiple paths that you eventually have to abandon, documenting all of this helps you through this kind of chaotic process, because you'll know what you have searched and what you haven't searched, and you'll be able to track and change things on the fly because you've got it all noted down. When reading, write notes. Don't just annotate or transfer directly into your writing. This is really important. So don't just read and then put that into your finished document. You need a process of writing notes, and I'm going to explain to you why. So note-taking is really important because it takes a long time to write a thesis. And if you're doing a doctoral thesis, 4 years or more. So you'll be reading sometimes the same documents for different purposes. So you'll be reading to develop the problem purpose statement, to write your literature review, to add and amend to the literature review chapter, and possibly even to help you with your conclusions. So you'll be coming back to these readings several times, and that's where the notes become very helpful. The notes also help you, they give you the space to notice and to analyze what's happening in the literature. So to see the patterns, the trends, and the emerging themes. So this is a format for note-taking that I want to suggest to you. Note down the full reference, the full citation in whatever formatting you use. So if you use APA, then note the reference in APA. Now, these notes you can do, in a Word document, in a physical tactile notebook, or you can do it in something like Mendeley using one of these software citation systems that will help you take notes. So where you take it is up to you, but this is the format I'm suggesting. Then the next part after the full citation would be a summary of the source text. And this is where you state what the paper's about. Now, most research papers follow a particular structure. There would be an introduction, an abstract, an introduction, a literature review, methodology, results, discussion, and conclusion section. So if you write a sentence or two about each of these sections, that will provide you with an overview summary. And you might include the key findings. But what you're saying is this paper is about, and this is what they found. After the summary, you have your interpretive or evaluative comments, and you really need to separate your thoughts from the summary because you don't want to inadvertently plagiarize 2 years down the line. So you want to make it very clear either by using a different color, a different font, some mechanism of making sure that you've separated your thoughts from the summary of the paper. And in this section, this is where you put your interpretation. So this is where you put, I'm thinking about this. I think I could use this in my paper in this way. This would help me with my argument. I'm not really convinced by this argument. I'm wondering why the author's assuming this. So this is where you would note any of your questions. You can also have positive comments where you can say, I think this is an excellent paper. It really shows how this concept works. And you can write it in language as if you're having a conversation to yourself. I just wanted to make this point that there are 2 ways to take information from a source text. So you can take information at the sentence level, and then you can take the summary information. And I think it's useful to think about that, because the summary information is about the big picture, what this paper is about, what are the conclusions they've drawn. Whereas the sentence level points of interest would be things like, there are a couple of points in the literature review that I think are interesting. They talk about this theory in a particular way that I think I can use. This note on methodology was interesting. I think so those are smaller points that you might include in your interpretive section, whereas the summary is the overall. And then the other thing you might want to think about in your notes is to take one or two quotes. Now, you don't want to have 10 to 20 quotes. You just want a couple that will really emphasize what these authors are saying and make a point of noting the page numbers for your referencing, but also so that you can go back and track the quotes. And the quotes would be verbatim in quotation marks. And it's really important to put them in quotation marks so that you don't make mistakes later. But then you would have really detailed notes to work from. And as you read over the years, add to these notes. So have a system that will allow you to add to these notes. And then use these notes, tip number 4, to organize your thinking. So you might go through a process of sorting, where you're sorting not only the source texts, but your notes. Some texts and some of your notes will no longer be relevant when you come to write the literature review chapter, and then you can delete them or put them aside. And this is like clearing out the clothes in your wardrobe. Some are no longer fashionable, some no longer fit, and you discard them accordingly. And you'll use your problem-purpose statement as the compass to help you make these decisions. And you're asking yourself, does the source text fit with the purpose of my research? And can I use the source text in a meaningful way in my chapter? So once you've made your notes, we're now moving into thinking about how to organize these notes. And one of the things that you can do is to look for themes. And this would be, maybe begin by looking for keywords in your reading and in your notes, and then you can note themes and you can begin to group papers according to these themes. Noting trends and patterns. So, where is the literature currently? Where has it come from? That would be a trend and a pattern. Looking at the debates, and this is a really important part of a literature review. The literature review always shows the contestation. Academic knowledge is contested because we're always coming from different positions. This is why we don't have dictionary definitions in academic work, because we acknowledge the fact that there are different positions and we align ourselves with certain positions. So including the debates is really important because it shows that you're not just picking up on the literature that supports your position, but that you are able to refute other positions. So you might organize the literature around the debates. This person believes this, but this person is in opposition to that. And academic debates really aren't in total opposition. They usually are about small differences or components. You could organize your notes chronologically, and this is actually quite a useful way of seeing the trends and the debates unfold over time. Because, a key author might have written something, and then another person writes in response to that initial paper, and other people write in response to that. And then you can see this pattern emerging over time. So just sorting your notes into date order of when they were published could be quite useful in helping you work out these patterns. Grouping together key authors and looking at their work even in date order as well, so you can see the evolution of their thinking, would be quite useful too. So think about how to organize your source texts and how to organize your notes, and use color highlights, annotations on your notes. In tip number 5, shape your notes to fit the requirements of a literature review. And what I mean by this is understand what goes into a literature review chapter. And what I'm talking about here is the expectations that your reader will have. So when a literature review chapter reader is reading this, they want these things to be in place. Now, there'll be differences depending on your discipline and your department and where you're located. So you will need to find out the exact things, but these are generally what are included. You would have an introduction section, which is a really important section of the literature review. You might revisit the problem and state the purpose of the review really clearly. You would establish the relevance of doing this literature review and the literature that you're about to cover. You might put in the scope of the review and the limitations, the delimitations. So if your field is huge, your topic is huge, then you might have to limit the literature according to I'm going to look at this 10-year period or 15-year period or whatever it is, or I'll only look in this context, the Canadian literature on this. So you might have other criteria that help you manage this process. Now, if your topic is really small, then you might have to expand the search to other fields, other related fields. So the scope and the delimitations really speak about the method of doing the search, as I mentioned earlier, and I've put a question mark next to it because you might not include this, but you may. And then you want to give some idea of the organization of the review. In the body of the review, you would have some organizational scheme to organize the literature. You might trace concepts, the evolution of concepts. You might group everything according to themes. You might discuss key debates. And then you want to link all of this with your overall arguments for doing this research. The conclusion section is, so in the body you would have several sections and you might organize them differently. The conclusion section again is really important. You can relate back to the purpose again, summarize the main points and themes that you've covered. You might want to have a statement or a paragraph that discusses an evaluation of the literature, and this could all be heading towards your knowledge gap. You also want to draw conclusions because essentially you will have done an analysis and a synthesis of the literature. So you want to come up with conclusions. And I would say just find 3 conclusions that you can say now that you've done this whole study of the literature. And you will be able to at the end of it. Ultimately, you're heading towards the knowledge gap and where your research fits so that you can then easily move into the next chapter. So the point I'm trying to make here is that you can organize your notes and your source texts according to different sections of the literature review chapter. So you might, in your notes, say, this will be good in the introduction. I can use this in this theme. I'm going to use this in the conclusion to emphasize the knowledge gap, something like that. You can also use your notes to analyze and synthesize your reading because obviously you want to move from summarizing into the higher order thinking skills. And it's much easier to do this in your notes than it is to do this when you are constructing the whole chapter. And often the literature review chapter gets overwhelming because you're trying to do all of these really complex things at the same time. So breaking them up and looking at them in terms of individual source texts in your notes can really help you build in this kind of critical thinking. So when you critique an individual source text, you'll build in critical thinking. But the other thing you can do is look across your notes and begin to analyze. So once you've got notes for 20 or 30 articles or whatever it is that you've read, you can go through them and say, okay, what am I seeing in this literature? And you can note themes and debates, patterns and trends. So that's analysis. Analysis is taking a concept, for example, and then breaking it up and according to what you're finding in the literature. So this author describes this concept in this way. This author describes that concept in that way. So this is your analysis now, as you're looking and you're finding how everyone in the literature understands this concept. Synthesis is then pulling it together again and commenting on it with insight. So you're saying something about that analysis with the insight you've gained from doing the analysis. So with both, you are grouping and reorganizing. Synthesis is really about pulling things together. So when you are analyzing the themes, you are grouping together the source texts according to themes, and you are describing and showing how the literature, has talked about these themes. With synthesis, you're pulling together those themes into meta themes or conclusions. So this is where you take a step back and you're saying, now that I've done this analysis, what can I say about this concept? I just wanted to give you an example from the Jones paper about themes. So this is what they said in their paper. This critical literature review is divided into two parts and covers themes of gendered power, structures, processes, and discourses. So you can see those are the themes that they have searched. They've searched, organized along the lines of structures, processes, and discourses. And they would discuss those as they relate to social work practice and education, both historical and contemporary. So they've organized the literature according to the themes, but they also have a chronological organization there. They're looking at it historically and contemporary. They also have a contextual organizing scheme because they're only looking at the literature on Australia. So that's just an example of what I've been trying to tell you. When it comes to analyzing and synthesizing the literature, use techniques to help you. I use organic maps, but I've seen my students use tables really well, where you would put a theme on top as the heading, authors and citations down the side, and then comments on the theme of the concept. Let's say if you are unpacking a concept, comments from these texts, and then your thoughts in another table. That really helps you to see how people differ in terms of their perspectives. I like organic maps because you can add to them. I'm messy, so I can sketch and notate without having to be organized. And I can draw links between things, and I can note page numbers of authors. I can scribble things and scratch them out. So organic maps really work for me. I find them exceptionally useful for literature reviews. Sketching is also a good idea. It might just help you put in place the building blocks of where you think you're going. Nobody has to see this part of your thinking. It's just for you. An organogram is where you start with a key thinker in a box, and then you look for where that person has influenced other thinkers in the field. So you map out the thinking in that field. They really do give your writing a level of depth that you wouldn't get if you were just transferring directly from the source texts. Use your notes to work out your arguments. So as I said earlier, you will be developing a number of different arguments in the literature review. One would be around the concepts you're using in your study, so how these concepts are understood and where you align yourself. So that would be your argument for a particular definition or way of seeing this concept. You would also develop an argument around the conceptual or theoretical framework of your study, if this is something that's relevant. And you would be making an argument about the research gap and the rationale for doing your study. So it's really helpful to use your notes to develop these arguments rather than trying to do it, when you write up the chapter. So I just wanted to give you an example of an argument, and I'm going to start in the middle again. Despite the numeric and symbolic representation of women in the sector, a solid body of literature has demonstrated that men prevail in high status positions of administration, policy theory, and management. This highlights the need to further support and promote women. So there's a really strong argument that although the sector is dominated by women, men prevail in higher status positions. So that's a sentence that encapsulates an argument. So with arguments, what you're doing is you're making claims where you align yourself with others in the research literature, and you present possible counter arguments as well, and then you might qualify your arguments. And I'll show you an example here so that I can show you what I mean. Literature shows that men are able to capitalize on specific valued masculinities in order to obtain high status and high paid positions. However, so there's the argument, right? And now we come to the however, which is the counter argument. However, this power is not unidirectional or monolithic, but instead contingent and nuanced. Men in disadvantaged or marginalized positions within society are less able to exert power. So what you can see from this is that there's a strong argument, but these authors know that there will be readers who will be thinking, but that's not always true. So they've built in a power argument, they've built in a counter argument to show that they understand these counter arguments. And then they qualify their argument to take that into account. So given this complex position within social work, it's worth considering how we do this to change the situation. So I hope you can see that in a nutshell. I do have videos on developing an argument as well. Use your notes to work out how to use citations. Just a few quick things on citations. So there are different ways you can cite, single citations and group citations. And although for you as a writer, they serve a particular purpose, they really do serve a purpose for a reader. Your reader is reading your citations as much as they are reading what you are writing. So single citations would be where you cite the one author, and group citations are where you cite multiple authors. What group citations show is that you are synthesizing, you have read widely, and that all these people say what you are saying. So you're telling the reader, although I think this, others do too. If you cite one citation, you're signaling to the reader that this is an important citation that has made this point. When you group citations together, you're saying to the reader, there are multiple authors who agree with this point, and I have read widely so that I know that these multiple authors make this point, the synthesis. You need to use these methods of citing quite deliberately, and your notes will help you to do that. So you can work out which notes you want to group together, and then you can cite them. Another way of looking at citations is author prominent or research prominent. So author prominent is where you foreground the author, and you say Williams argues. When you do that, your reader, what you're telling your reader is this author is important. And that's why I'm drawing on their authority. When you use the research prominent way of citing, where the author is backgrounded and you're focusing on the point that they made, this is a way of making it look more fact-like. So the first way is more you're foregrounding the author's argument, but when you use research prominent citations, you're making the research look more fact-like. Again, you can use these deliberately, but bearing in mind that your reader is reading into the way you cite. So just to give you an example of this. So first, as noted by Crawford and Laitman and Mendes, so not just one author, there are two authors, so it makes it stronger. Australian social work is not a profession with a strong sense of its own history. That is, while notable histories of social work have been published, and there's a whole spate of references to say We've done our reading. We know that these histories exist. And here are all the histories if you want to go and look at them. There are some absences. So there's a synthesis statement of the literature. So here's something you can say after having done this literature review, that although these studies exist, there are some absences. And then second, those who do take gender as their main concern are becoming dated. So something's happening there. That's a very significant thing to notice in the literature. So you can see that the multiple citations help provide evidence for that strong argument. And again, if you look at the first as noted by Crawford and Laitman and Mendes, there the authors have been foregrounded, and they would have been foregrounded for a particular reason. Notice how when you're reading, notice how authors read and use citations and promote their arguments or draw on the authorities of source texts. Okay, number 9, use your notes to begin writing. What I'd like to suggest here is that your notes become the beginnings of lots of bits and pieces of writing. When you're analyzing and synthesizing, write memos to yourself where you're saying things like, I can see this pattern, or I'm beginning to see how this concept looks in this literature. People have changed their thinking around this concept from this author to this author. So these are just notes to yourself. Again, you don't have to show anyone. They just help you to verbalize your thinking, so that instead of doing all of this when you come to write the paper, you've got all these notes and you've thought them out. And then use your notes to plan an outline to help you sketch an outline of the chapter. So you will have an idea of what needs to go into all the sections, but your notes will give you the specific details. You can say, I'm going to look at these authors in the introduction. I'm going to look at those authors under theme 1. And you can even put page numbers next to them because, your notes will be so detailed. Use your notes to write manageable sections. So you'll take these 10 notes on one theme and you'll use them to begin constructing the section around that particular theme. And then use the sections that you've written to write up the draft. So rather than sitting down and saying, I have to write this literature review, you will have done a lot of preparation, a lot of bits and pieces of writing that you can pull together into sections. The sections become drafts, and those drafts can be terrible in the beginning. You can have big gaps and notes to yourself where you say, figure out this, add in that. You might need to move things around and reorganize it. And those initial drafts, you don't show anyone again. You fix them up, and then when they're at a point where you're happy with them, then you can give them to your supervisor or whoever you want to read it. So you work your way into the paper through these bits and pieces of writing, and you don't focus on making it perfect. You fix it up and fix it up and fix it up until it gets to a point where it's pretty good. My big tip, and if you've watched my videos, you would have seen this before multiple times, is to schedule writing time, even if it's only 10 or 15 minutes. So whatever time you think you can mentally get your head around, schedule that time and then sit there for that time. Don't get up, don't go on Facebook, don't do anything. If you can't write, you just sit there for that time until you actually start writing. And then during that time, you can use it for multiple things with the literature review. In the beginning, it would be reading and writing notes. Later on, it might be analyzing, synthesizing, and writing memo notes. And after that, you might be writing sections and building up the draft. And I would suggest using free writing as a technique where you set a timer for the 5, 10, 15 minutes. And during that time, you might read your notes beforehand, set the timer, and then just write about a theme, for example. Once you've finished your writing, you can go back to your notes. You can add in quotes, add in references, page numbers, build on what you've written, but it's a way into the writing so that you don't sit there and do nothing for ages. It's a very successful way to develop writing fluency. My last thoughts are, if you're still finding it really hard to get your head around the literature review, because I know it's it's very difficult to figure out how much to read, when do you stop, how do you make sense of everything in all these different papers and chapters. Think about a courtroom metaphor where you are a lawyer and you are calling on expert witnesses to provide support for your arguments. But other lawyers also will counter argue against you, so you have to refute the counter arguments. And the reader is the judge, and they have to see whether or not they are convinced by your argument. It might just be a way of helping you to think your way through the literature review. I've noted these two books here because there are lots of books on literature reviews, but these two are particularly accessible and extremely helpful. So if you are looking for more sources to help you, these two would certainly do that. These are my references for this particular presentation. If you want to look more closely, then you can stop the video and have a look at that. And finally, I just want to say thank you for watching the presentation, to take a deep breath when it comes to the literature review, to enjoy the process. To me, the reading is the best part of doing a literature review. I love seeing what research projects come up with and how I can use those particular projects. So try and enjoy the process, and watch the other videos that I've got on YouTube around the problem purpose statement, around the literature review. I've got a series of videos on reading and note taking, a series of videos on developing arguments, and various other things that are quite practical that you can use in developing this chapter. And best of luck with it, and I hope that you get through it fairly easily and enjoy the process in the end. Thanks. Bye.